Thank you for listening to this episode of Church History Stories. If you haven't already, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us reach more people who, are interested in understanding the complexities of church history. Today, we're diving deep into a significant event that has sent shockwaves through the Church of England: the resignation of Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby amidst a major abuse scandal. This isn't just about headlines. We're going beyond the surface to uncover hidden patterns and missed opportunities for intervention, all meticulously detailed in the recent Independent Learning Lessons Review, often referred to as the Macon Report. This deep dive is particularly crucial, I think, for those who want to grasp the intricacies of church leadership, accountability, and how institutions respond to abuse allegations over extended periods, sometimes spanning decades. To set the scene, let's briefly clarify who the key players are in this story. Justin Welby, as many of you know, served as the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest-ranking cleric in the Church of England. John Smyth, a prominent lawyer and an influential figure within evangelical Christian circles, was unfortunately also a prolific abuser. The Macon Report, commissioned by the Archbishops Council, meticulously details the Church of England's response to the abuses of John Smyth. It covers a period from January 1st, 1970 to August 1st, 1970, to August 1st, 2019, revealing a deeply troubling pattern of inaction and missed opportunities. Now, what exactly did John Smyth do? His abuse was both physical and psychological, targeting young men often within the context of religious retreats and camps. The report uncovers Smith's calculated grooming tactics, leveraging his position, influence, and charisma to gain the trust of victims and those around them. Victim testimonies paint a harrowing picture of beatings, manipulation, and attempts to control their relationships and lives. The abuse began in the UK, then continued in Zimbabwe and South Africa. This pattern of abuse sadly went unchecked for far too long. Perhaps the most shocking revelation of the Macon Report is the existence of a detailed report compiled in 1982, known as the Ruston Report, which exposed Smith's abuse. This report was known to a select group within the Church of England. The question that arises is, why wasn't this information acted upon? Why wasn't law enforcement involved? At the time, the flawed rationale for the cover-up was protecting the victims' reputations and futures. However, the Macon Report reveals a disturbing lack of consultation with the victims and a clear prioritization of institutional reputation over the well-being of those who suffered. This cover-up went beyond simply ignoring the problem. One bishop even advised John Smyth to leave the country, suggesting a different part of the UK or moving abroad. This demonstrates a deliberate attempt to manage the problem, not to address it head-on. The report also reveals that despite knowledge of the abuse, Smyth continued to receive financial support from church members, allowing him to continue his ministry and, tragically, his pattern of abuse. It is clear from the Macon Report that opportunities to intervene and prevent further harm were missed time and time again. For example, Smyth was rejected for ordination in the Church of England in 1981. This could have been a turning point, a chance to stop his influence and prevent future abuse. However, the abuse continued, and Smyth even founded the Zambezi Trust, an organization he used to further his ministry and influence in Africa, extending his reach and leaving a trail of victims in his wake. This brings us to Justin Welby's connection to this complex and tragic story. It is a fact that Welby attended Iwern camps where Smyth was a leader. The two knew each other, and Welby even received warnings about Smyth's concerning behavior. In 2013, when Welby was already the Archbishop of Canterbury, he received a disclosure about Smyth's abuse. While he referred the matter to the Bishop of Ely, he didn't personally follow up or ensure a thorough investigation took place. The Macon Report concludes that Welby could and should have reported the abuse to the police in 2013, a stark indictment of his actions. This failure to act had devastating consequences. It wasn't until 2017, years after the initial disclosures, that the abuse scandal became public knowledge, sparking outrage and media scrutiny. A police investigation, Operation Cubic, was launched after a Channel 4 News expose. Tragically, John Smyth died in 2018 before facing any legal repercussions for his actions. The Macon Report's findings are deeply unsettling. It paints a picture of a church culture that prioritized secrecy and reputation over accountability and the well-being of victims. There was a clear pattern of inaction and missed opportunities by church officials to stop Smyth's abuse, and a lack of proper safeguarding measures failed to center the needs of the victims. This story took a dramatic turn when a damning report into child abuse associated with the Church of England surfaced. This independent review, commissioned by the Archbishops Council, uncovered a deeply disturbing truth. Justin Welby, despite his position as Archbishop of Canterbury, failed to report John Smyth's abuse to the police. When he first learned about it in 2013, The report unequivocally states that Mr. Welby could and should have taken action, placing a heavy burden of responsibility on his shoulders. The weight of these findings ultimately led to Mr. Welby's decision to resign, a move that has sent shockwaves through the Church of England and beyond. The gravity of the situation is undeniable. A review spanning from 1970 to 2019, encompassing nearly 5 decades, meticulously examined the Church of England's response to the abuses perpetrated by John Smyth. The report commissioned by the Archbishops Council sought to understand how an institution as influential as the Church of England could have failed so dramatically in its duty to protect the vulnerable. At the heart of this tragedy are the victims. The review team spent extensive time listening to their stories, ensuring their voices were central to understanding the depth and scope of Smyth's abuse. The report meticulously documents their accounts, providing a chilling and stark reminder of the lasting impact of abuse. Their testimonies paint a picture of a man who used his position and charisma to manipulate and abuse young men, often within the context of religious retreats and camps. Their experiences provide the foundation for understanding the institutional failures that allowed these abuses to continue unchecked for far too long. We must acknowledge that understanding past events requires considering the social and legal context of the time. For instance, the review highlights that in 1973, the tragic death of Maria Colwell, a young girl murdered by her stepfather, sparked public outcry and led to a government inquiry. This inquiry ultimately resulted in the Children Act of 1975, demonstrating a growing awareness of child protection issues, even as Smyth's abuse was taking place. The report doesn't shy away from detailing the horrific nature of Smyth's actions. Victims recounted experiencing beatings so severe that they resulted in broken skin and bleeding. These accounts are incredibly difficult to hear, but they are essential in exposing the truth about Smyth's cruelty and the devastating consequences of his abuse. The review directly addresses the legal implications of Smyth's actions, stating that his behavior constituted assault, occasioning actual bodily harm, a clear violation of the law. The report reveals that Smyth's abuse was widespread, affecting at least 26 to 30 victims in the UK alone, with the actual number likely being higher. Many of these victims were students of prestigious institutions, like Winchester College and Cambridge University, highlighting the extent of Smyth's reach and the trust he'd cultivated within elite circles. The victims' stories are heart-wrenching, filled with feelings of worthlessness, guilt, and shame. Many have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, struggling with broken relationships and the lingering effects of abuse. The report acknowledges the ongoing trauma they face, emphasizing the need for continued support and understanding. It is important to recognize that the impact of Smyth's abuse extended beyond the direct victims. Family members also experienced shock, confusion, and anger as they grappled with the revelation of these horrific events. The report highlights the ripple effect of Smyth's actions, demonstrating the profound and lasting impact on entire families. The abuse suffered by Smyth's victims has left indelible marks on their lives. Some have faced further distress due to being pursued and named as victims on social media, raising concerns about privacy and the right to choose when and how to share their experiences. The report underscores the importance of respecting victims' autonomy and recognizing their right to silence, highlighting the potential for re-traumatization through unwanted public exposure. The story of John Smyth's abuse is intricately woven with the history of institutions like Winchester College and the Iron camps. The report delves into Smyth's involvement with these institutions, tracing his rise to prominence and his manipulation of young men within these settings. Smyth's early life offers some insight into the development of his abusive tendencies. The report describes how his father, also a prominent lawyer, held high expectations for him, potentially contributing to Smyth's drive for dominance and control. Smyth's involvement with the Irony camps began in 1964, when he was just 22 years old. He quickly gained influence within the organization, becoming a prominent figure and leading dormitories, giving talks and fostering a sense of elitism among the young men who attended the camps. The report highlights Smyth's calculated grooming techniques, revealing how he used his position and charisma to manipulate those around him. Victims recounted his skillful use of flattery, gifts, and special attention, creating a sense of obligation and dependence that made them more vulnerable to his abuse. Smyth's abuse escalated over time. He introduced the concept of physical punishment as a means of spiritual growth, a twisted interpretation of religious teachings that he used to justify his horrific actions. He even went so far as to ask victims to report their sins to him so that they could be punished, a clear demonstration of his desire for control and his manipulation of religious beliefs. The report documents numerous instances of physical abuse, detailing how Smyth would beat young men with canes and other implements, often demanding that they be naked from the waist down. These beatings were carried out in various locations, including sheds, bathrooms, and even during trips organized by Smyth. The brutality of Smyth's actions is undeniable. Victims describe the physical pain of the beatings, the emotional trauma of the experience, and the fear they felt in his presence. The report makes it clear that these were not isolated incidents, but a sustained pattern of abuse that Smyth perpetrated over many years. Smyth's influence extended beyond Winchester College and the Awareness camps. He also held leadership positions in the Christian Forum at the college, further solidifying his position of authority and access to potential victims. His involvement in these organizations gave him a platform to preach his distorted theology, manipulating young men into believing that physical punishment was a necessary part of their spiritual journey. The report sheds light on the culture within these institutions, revealing a concerning lack of oversight and accountability that allowed Smyth's abuse to continue unabated. It highlights the dangers of unquestioning deference to authority figures, particularly within religious contexts, and the urgent need for robust safeguarding measures to protect the vulnerable. Smyth's manipulation and abuse were not limited to physical violence. He also engaged in psychological manipulation, seeking to control every aspect of his victims' lives. He interfered in their relationships, dictating who they could be friends with, and even attempting to control their romantic relationships. The report documents how Smyth used letter correspondence and phone calls to maintain his control over victims even when they were physically separated from him. He instilled a sense of fear and obligation in his victims, ensuring their continued silence and obedience. It is essential to recognize that Smyth's abuse had a devastating and long-lasting impact on his victims. The report details the psychological trauma they endured, including feelings of worthlessness, guilt, shame, and the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. Many victims struggled with their faith, feeling betrayed by the religious teachings that Smyth had twisted to justify his abuse. The report highlights the insidious nature of grooming, revealing how Smyth used his charm, intelligence, and position of authority to manipulate his victims into trusting him. He exploited their vulnerability and their desire for spiritual guidance, turning their faith against them to perpetuate his abuse. Smyth's abuse did not go completely unnoticed. The report documents several instances where individuals raised concerns about his behavior. Teachers, parents, and even fellow students at Winchester College expressed their worries, but their warnings were often dismissed or ignored. The report details how Smyth's charismatic personality and his ability to deflect criticism allowed him to maintain his position of authority despite the growing suspicions surrounding his behavior. It reveals the power dynamics that can operate within institutions, often silencing those who dare to speak out against those in positions of power. One particularly disturbing incident involved a parent who approached a teacher at Winchester College with concerns about Smyth's involvement in satanic rituals at the school. The teacher, instead of investigating the matter or reporting it to the appropriate authorities, dismissed the parent's concerns and chose to believe Smyth's version of events. This incident highlights the dangers of blindly trusting authority figures and the failure to take seriously allegations of abuse, particularly when they involve vulnerable young people. The report also describes how Smyth used his wife, Anne, to further his manipulation and control. She would often be present during the beatings, cleaning up the blood and providing bandages afterward. Her presence not only normalized the abuse, but also made it more difficult for victims to speak out, as they felt a sense of obligation to protect her from the truth. The report details how Smyth carefully curated his public image, presenting himself as a devout Christian and a respected member of society. He used his legal expertise and his religious connections to build a network of supporters who shielded him from scrutiny. This facade of respectability made it even more difficult for victims to believe that they would be taken seriously if they came forward with their allegations. In 1982, the truth about Smyth's abuse finally came to light when a group of victims disclosed their experiences to a trusted individual within the Iran camps. These disclosures led to the compilation of the Rustin Report, a detailed account of Smyth's abuse that was presented to a select group of individuals within the organization. The Rustin Report exposed the extent of Smyth's abuse, documenting his beatings, his psychological manipulation, and his grooming tactics. It also revealed that Smyth had been rejected for ordination in the Church of England in 1981, a decision that could have potentially prevented further abuse had the reasons for his rejection been more widely known. The individuals who received the Rustin Report faced a critical decision. Would they expose Smyth's abuse and seek justice for his victims, or would they prioritize protecting the reputation of the Iran camps and the individuals involved? Tragically, they chose the latter path, opting for a cover-up that allowed Smyth to continue his abuse unchecked for many years. The report details the flawed reasoning behind the decision to cover up Smyth's abuse. The individuals involved claimed that they were acting in the best interests of the victims, arguing that public exposure would damage their reputations in futures. However, the report makes it clear that this was a self-serving justification, as the victims themselves were never consulted about their preferences, and were denied the opportunity to seek justice for the crimes committed against them. The cover-up involved a concerted effort to silence victims and prevent the truth from coming to light. Individuals were assigned to provide pastoral support to victims, a euphemism for monitoring their behavior and ensuring their continued silence. Smyth himself was pressured to leave the UK not as a consequence of his actions, but as a means of damage control, allowing him to escape accountability and continue his abuse elsewhere. The report reveals the complicity of multiple individuals in the cover-up, including Church of England clergy lawyers and members of the Iran Trust. Their actions demonstrate a deeply concerning culture of secrecy and prioritizing institutional reputation over the well-being of victims. The failure to report Smyth's abuse to the police allowed him to evade justice and enabled him to continue his pattern of abuse, leaving a trail of devastated lives in his wake. In 1984, Smyth and his family moved to Zimbabwe, continuing his involvement in Christian ministry and, tragically, his pattern of abuse. The report details how Smyth established the Zambezi Trust, an organization that he used to further his ministry and influence in Africa. This move not only allowed Smyth to continue his abuse unchecked, but also demonstrated the failure of the individuals who had covered up his crimes in the UK to prevent him from accessing new victims. The report documents how Smyth continued to receive financial support from individuals and organizations in the UK despite the knowledge of his past abuse. This financial support enabled him to expand his ministry in Africa and provided him with the resources to continue his grooming and abuse of young men. The report details how Smyth used his position within the Zambezi Trust to gain access to vulnerable young men, often within the context of religious camps and retreats. He employed the same grooming tactics that he had used in the UK, manipulating young men with flattery gifts and special attention, creating a sense of obligation and dependence that made them more vulnerable to his abuse. The report documents multiple instances of physical and psychological abuse perpetrated by Smyth in Zimbabwe, including beating, sexual assaults, and the manipulation of religious teachings to justify his actions. It reveals a horrifying pattern of abuse that continued for years, devastating the lives of numerous young men. One particularly tragic incident involved the death of Guy Nachuru, a young man who drowned during a Zambezi Trust camp in 1992. The circumstances surrounding his death raised serious concerns about Smyth's involvement and the lack of adequate safety measures at the camp. The report details how Smyth was charged with culpable homicide in connection with Nachuru's death, but he was ultimately acquitted. The trial brought to light further evidence of Smyth's abusive behavior, but the acquittal allowed him to continue his ministry and his abuse unchecked. The report highlights the failure of individuals and organizations in both the UK and Zimbabwe to take adequate action to prevent Smyth's continued abuse. It reveals a disturbing lack of accountability and a willingness to turn a blind eye to allegations of abuse, even when they involve the death of a young man. The Zambezi Trust, despite the growing evidence of Smyth's abuse, continued to support his ministry, choosing to believe his denials and prioritizing the reputation of the organization over the well-being of potential victims. This institutional failure had devastating consequences, allowing Smyth's abuse to continue unabated and leaving a legacy of pain and trauma for many years to come. The revelations of Smyth's abuse in Zimbabwe led to increased scrutiny of his actions in the UK, but his network of supporters continued to shield him from accountability. The report details how Smyth used his legal expertise and his connections within the Church of England to deflect criticism and maintain his position of power. The report documents how Smyth continued to receive financial support from individuals and organizations in the UK, even after the extent of his abuse became more widely known. This financial support enabled him to continue his ministry and maintain his lifestyle, providing him with the resources to evade justice and silence his critics. The report highlights the failure of the Church of England to take decisive action against Smyth, despite the mounting evidence of his abuse. It reveals a culture of protecting abusers and prioritizing institutional reputation over the well-being of victims. This institutional failure had far-reaching consequences, enabling Smyth to continue his pattern of abuse and causing further harm to countless individuals. In 1989, John Thorne, the former headmaster of Winchester College, published his autobiography, The Road to Winchester. This book contained a brief but damning account of Smyth's abuse at the school, bringing the scandal to a wider audience and sparking renewed calls for accountability. The report details how Thorne's book led to the resignation of the entire board of the UK's Zambezi Trust, but Smyth himself remained defiant, dismissing the allegations as exaggerations and continuing to receive support from his remaining loyalists. Thorne's book brought the issue of Smyth's abuse back into the public eye, but the Church of England's response remained inadequate. The report documents how the Church failed to conduct a thorough investigation into the allegations, choosing instead to rely on Smyth's denials and the assurances of his supporters. This failure to take decisive action had serious consequences. It allowed Smyth to continue his ministry and maintain his access to potential victims. It also sent a message to survivors that their experiences were not being taken seriously and that the Church was more concerned with protecting its own reputation than with seeking justice for those who had been harmed. The publication of Thorne's book was a pivotal moment in the story of Smyth's abuse. It demonstrated the power of speaking out and the importance of holding institutions accountable for their failures to protect the vulnerable. However, the Church of England's inadequate response highlighted the ongoing challenges in addressing abuse within religious contexts, and the urgent need for systemic change to prioritize the well-being of victims over institutional reputation. Following the publication of John Thorne's book, a cascade of events unfolded, revealing a deeply unsettling pattern of awareness and inaction within the Church of England regarding John Smyth's abuse. This revelation began with David Pope, a member of the Zambezi Trust UK board, contacting key figures who had knowledge of Smyth's past abuse, including David McInnes, David Fletcher, and Mark Ashton. These individuals confirmed the bare bones of the matter, and McInnes even provided a copy of the Ruston Report, the 1982 document that detailed Smyth's abuse at Winchester College. This exchange demonstrates that a significant network of individuals within the Church were aware of the gravity of Smyth's actions, yet no decisive steps were taken to address the issue or prevent further harm. The LCF, an organization with close ties to Smyth, also grappled with the implications of his past abuse. They debated his potential attendance at their upcoming conference in Birmingham, acknowledging the concerns surrounding his behavior but ultimately failing to take a firm stance against his involvement. This hesitation reflects a broader pattern of prioritizing Smyth's perceived talents and contributions over the safety and well-being of potential victims. The concerns surrounding Smyth's behavior extended beyond the LCF. The Reverend Patrick Whitworth of Christ Church, Gypsy Hill, reached out to David Fletcher, seeking guidance on whether to proceed with fundraising for Zambezi Ministries, an organization closely associated with Smyth. Whitworth's letter explicitly references concerns about Smyth's past activities and raises questions about his trustworthiness. This incident demonstrates that knowledge of Smyth's abuse was circulating within the Church, yet it failed to translate into decisive action to protect vulnerable individuals. Mark Ashton, a figure deeply involved in the efforts to manage Smyth's behavior, wrote a letter to Jamie Coleman expressing his concerns about Smyth's activities in Zimbabwe. Ashton's letter highlights Smyth's pattern of deceiving his colleagues and his tendency to establish over-intense relationships with young men, echoing the concerns raised in the Ruston Report. Despite these warnings, Smyth's ministry in Africa continued to receive support from individuals and organizations within the Church of England, allowing him to maintain his position of authority and his access to potential victims. The story of John Smyth's abuse is a tragic illustration of the complex interplay between individual actions and institutional failures. It highlights the devastating consequences of prioritizing reputation over accountability, the insidious nature of grooming and manipulation, and the long-lasting impact of abuse on survivors and their families. Smyth's ability to evade justice for so long is a testament to the power dynamics that can operate within institutions, particularly those rooted in religious beliefs and authority. The report reveals a culture of silence and denial that protected abusers and silenced victims, allowing harmful behavior to continue unchecked for decades. The report's findings are a stark reminder that safeguarding must be a priority for any organization that works with children and young adults. Robust policies, transparent procedures, and a culture of accountability are essential in preventing abuse and ensuring that those who have been harmed feel safe to come forward. The story is far from over. The Church of England must grapple with the implications of this report, taking meaningful steps to address its past failures and prevent future harm. Survivors deserve to see justice served, and the Church must demonstrate a genuine commitment to creating a safer environment for all those who come under its care. The year 1990 brought a series of events that further illuminated the extent of John Smyth's abusive behavior and the continued failure of individuals and organizations to take decisive action to protect potential victims. The Zambezi Ministry's newsletter, Zambezi Currents, published an article that acknowledged the storms faced by the organization in the previous year. Jamie Coleman's appointment as the new chair of the UK Trust signaled an attempt to stabilize the organization. But it did not address the underlying issue of Smyth's abusive behavior. Despite efforts to downplay Smyth's past actions, concerns about his behavior persisted. The head of Peterhouse School, while permitting his Zambezi mission to proceed, expressed his reservations about Smyth's involvement and insisted on keeping him under close supervision. This incident reveals that knowledge of Smyth's abuse had reached those responsible for the welfare of young people. Yet it failed to translate into a complete ban on his participation in activities that provided him with access to potential victims. Financial support for Smyth's ministry continued despite the growing evidence of his abuse. The Reverend Patrick Whitworth, after learning about Smyth's past activities, withdrew his church's commitment to raising funds for the Zambezi ministry, demonstrating that some individuals were willing to take a stand against supporting an organization associated with an abuser. However, other individuals and organizations continued to provide financial support, enabling Smyth to continue his ministry and maintain his access to vulnerable young men. Mark Ashton, despite his earlier concerns about Smyth's behavior, found himself unable to effectively stop Smyth's work with young people. His attempts to persuade Smyth to cease his involvement were met with defiance, highlighting the limitations of informal efforts to manage an abuser who lacked genuine remorse and a willingness to change his behavior. A particularly concerning incident involves Smyth's invitation to speak at a mission event in Australia. Despite knowledge of his past abuse, organizers considered allowing him to participate, demonstrating the continued failure to prioritize the safety and well-being of potential victims over Smyth's perceived talents and the desire to avoid public scandal. As concerns about Smyth's behavior mounted, those who had knowledge of his past abuse found themselves grappling with the ethical dilemma of whether to speak out or remain silent. The fear of damaging reputations, causing divisions within the church, and facing legal repercussions kept many individuals from taking decisive action, allowing Smyth to continue his abuse unchecked. The year 1990 revealed a continued pattern of awareness and inaction regarding John Smyth's abuse. The Church of England, despite its knowledge of Smyth's past actions, failed to implement robust safeguarding measures or take decisive action to prevent further harm. Lack of accountability and the prioritization of institutional reputation over the well-being of victims enabled Smyth to continue his ministry and maintain his access to vulnerable young men. This institutional failure had devastating consequences, allowing Smyth's abuse to persist and leaving a legacy of pain and trauma for many years to come. The year 1991 brought further revelations about the extent of John Smyth's abuse and the ongoing failure of individuals and organizations to take decisive action to protect potential victims. Despite the mounting evidence of his harmful behavior, Smyth continued to receive support from certain quarters within the Church of England, enabling him to maintain his position of authority and his access to vulnerable young men. In a troubling incident, a group of individuals associated with the Iwern Trust, an organization closely linked to Smyth, gathered to discuss his past abuse. However, instead of taking concrete steps to prevent further harm, they opted for a course of action that prioritized discretion and protecting reputations. This decision reflected a broader pattern within the Church of England of prioritizing institutional image over the safety and well-being of potential victims. The concerns surrounding Smyth's behavior were not limited to his past actions in the UK. Reports of his problematic conduct in Zimbabwe began to surface, including allegations of inappropriate relationships with young men and the use of harsh disciplinary measures. These reports raised serious questions about Smyth's suitability for ministry and the potential for him to harm those under his care. Despite these warning signs, Smyth continued to receive support from certain individuals and organizations within the Church of England. Jamie Coleman, a prominent figure within the Zambezi Trust, maintained his belief in Smyth's repentance and continued to advocate for his ministry despite the growing evidence of his harmful behavior. This unwavering support enabled Smyth to evade accountability and continue his pattern of abuse. The year 1991 marked a turning point in the story of John Smyth's abuse. It became increasingly clear that his behavior was not an isolated incident, but a deeply ingrained pattern of harmful conduct that posed a serious risk to those under his influence. However, the Church of England, despite its growing awareness of the problem, continued to prioritize institutional reputation over the well-being of potential victims. This institutional failure had devastating consequences, allowing Smyth's abuse to continue unabated and leaving a legacy of pain and trauma for many years to come. In 1992, the tragic death of Guy Nyachuru at his Zambezi Trust camp in Zimbabwe cast a stark light on the dangers of John Smyth's unchecked behavior. This incident, coupled with mounting concerns about his conduct with young men, sparked a crisis within the organization and forced a reckoning with the long-ignored issue of Smyth's abusive tendencies. The death of Guy Nyachuru, a young man who drowned during a camp activity, raised serious questions about the safety measures in place at Zambezi Trust events and Smyth's role in the tragedy. Witnesses recounted Smyth's erratic behavior and his failure to take adequate precautions to ensure the safety of the participants. Following the drowning, Smyth faced charges of culpable homicide, but he was ultimately acquitted. The trial brought to light further evidence of Smyth's abusive behavior, including his use of harsh physical discipline and his manipulation of young men. The acquittal, while providing Smyth with legal vindication, did not erase the concerns about his conduct. Individuals and organizations within the Church of England found themselves grappling with the implications of the trial and the mounting evidence of Smyth's abusive behavior. The Zambezi Trust, despite the tragic death of Guy Nyachuru and the revelations of Smyth's abuse, continued to support his ministry. This decision reflected a deeply concerning pattern within the organization of prioritizing institutional loyalty and protecting reputations over the safety and well-being of potential victims. The year 1992 marked a pivotal moment in the story of John Smyth's abuse. The death of Guy Nyachuru exposed the tragic consequences of his unchecked behavior and the failure of individuals and organizations to take decisive action to protect vulnerable young men. The Zambezi Trust, despite the mounting evidence of Smyth's abuse, continued to support his ministry, demonstrating a profound lack of accountability and a willingness to prioritize institutional reputation over the well-being of those under its care. Moving on to 1993, we see a growing awareness of John Smyth's abusive behavior within the Church of England. This led to increased scrutiny of his ministry and mounting pressure for him to address the allegations. Yet despite these efforts, Smyth continued to find support, enabling him to maintain his position and continue his harmful conduct. The Zambezi Trust, closely associated with Smyth's ministry in Africa, faced a crisis as concerns mounted. A group of pastors in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, confronted Smyth about his conduct, expressing alarm over his inappropriate relationships with young men and his use of harsh physical discipline. This confrontation signaled a growing unease and a willingness to challenge his authority. How did Smyth's supporters react? They tried to downplay the severity of his actions, portraying him as a victim of cultural misunderstandings. They argued that his disciplinary methods were acceptable within the Zimbabwean context, and that his relationships with young men were purely pastoral. These attempts to deflect criticism and protect Smyth's reputation only further enabled him to evade accountability. The pastors in Bulawayo, unconvinced by Smyth's justifications and concerned about his continued access to young men, sought to restrict his ministry within their community. They imposed conditions on his involvement, including prohibiting him from working with young people and requiring him to undergo psychological evaluation. These actions demonstrated a real commitment to safeguarding and a willingness to prioritize the well-being of potential victims. It's a stark contrast to the response from some within the Church of England. Despite the growing concerns and restrictions, Smyth continued to receive support from certain individuals within the Church. Jamie Coleman, a prominent figure within the Zambezi Trust, maintained his belief in Smyth's repentance and continued to advocate for his ministry. This unwavering support, coupled with the reluctance of others to take decisive action, allowed Smyth to evade accountability and continue his harmful behavior. 1993 then reveals a deeply concerning pattern of enabling and denial within the Church regarding Smyth's abuse. Despite mounting evidence and the efforts of those who sought to protect potential victims, influential figures within the organization continued to support him. This institutional failure had devastating consequences, allowing Smyth's abuse to continue and leaving a legacy of pain and trauma. Now fast forward to 1997, a pivotal year in this story. John Smyth finally faced legal consequences for his actions in Zimbabwe. This trial, though long overdue, brought to light the extent of his harmful behavior and the failure of individuals and organizations to protect vulnerable young men. Remember, following Guy Nyachuru's death in 1992, Smyth faced culpable homicide charges but was acquitted. That trial, however, exposed disturbing evidence of his abusive behavior. Then, in 1997, Smyth was brought to trial again, this time on assault charges stemming from his beatings of young men during Zambezi Trust camps. The trial, held in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, exposed the brutal nature of Smyth's actions and the lasting trauma he inflicted. Witnesses recounted their experiences of being beaten with canes and other implements, often until they bled. They described the psychological manipulation Smyth employed to control them, including his use of religious teachings to justify his violence. Think about that, twisting faith to justify such cruelty. This trial thankfully gave Smyth victims a platform to speak out, breaking the silence that had surrounded his abuse for so long. Their testimonies were powerful and heartbreaking, exposing the truth about Smyth's cruelty and the devastating impact he had. The trial resulted in Smyth's conviction on 4 counts of assault. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a landmark decision, the first time he faced real consequences. But even this victory couldn't erase the years of trauma endured by his victims. And disturbingly, the Zambezi Trust, despite the revelations of the trial, continued to support Smyth. This demonstrates a shocking lack of accountability and a disturbing willingness to prioritize institutional loyalty over the well-being of those harmed. While 1997 marked a significant step towards justice, it also highlighted the ongoing challenges in addressing abuse within religious contexts. The trial revealed the power dynamics at play within institutions, the insidious nature of grooming and manipulation, and the long-lasting impact on survivors. Smyth's conviction was crucial, but it also underscored the urgent need for systemic change. The period between 1998 and 2002 reveals a complicated picture. Survivors continued to grapple with the trauma they'd endured. Affidavits detailing their experiences prepared for the legal proceedings provided a chilling account of the abuse they suffered. These documents are a testament to the lasting impact of Smyth's actions and the ongoing need for support and healing. Despite the conviction, Smyth's influence within certain circles of the Church of England persisted. The Zambezi Trust continued to operate, raising serious concerns about potential further harm and the lack of accountability. In 1999, Robin Weeks, who would later be ordained, was informed of a previous issue regarding Smyth's conduct at Winchester College. While the specifics weren't shared, the warning itself suggests that knowledge of Smyth's past was still circulating. This highlights the ongoing challenge of transparency and accountability within religious institutions. Imagine a crucial piece of information buried for years. Smyth, meanwhile, continued his ministry in South Africa, working with vulnerable young men through the Zambezi Trust. Despite the knowledge of his past, he remained respected in certain church circles, raising alarming concerns about potential further harm and inadequate safeguarding. Then in 2005, Smyth published a book, Unshackled, a sanitized account of his life and ministry. No mention of his abusive behavior, of course. This book became a platform for Smyth to present himself as a devout Christian leader, further obscuring the truth. The Zambezi Trust, despite ongoing concerns, continued to support his ministry. This raises serious questions about their commitment to safeguarding. Were they prioritizing institutional loyalty over the well-being of potential victims? In 2006, Anthony Cordell, aware of Smyth's abuse for years, moved to Cape Town and began meeting with him regularly. He tried to discuss Smyth's past, but Smyth refused to engage, a clear sign of his lack of remorse. Around this time, evidence emerged that Smyth was still involved in Bible study groups with young men in South Africa. This raised immediate concerns about the potential for him to reoffend. In 2007, the Zambezi Trust in Canada ceased operations after failing to file a tax return. This incident, while seemingly unrelated, highlighted the lack of oversight within the organization. So from 2002 onward, we see a troubling pattern. Survivors sought justice, institutions made some progress with safeguarding, but a lack of accountability allowed Smyth to maintain influence and evade full responsibility. This part of the story is a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked power manipulation and the lasting impacts of abuse on survivors and their families. It's a tragic pattern we see repeating itself. From 2012 to 2016, a series of critical events brought Smyth's abuse back into the spotlight, forcing the Church of England to confront its past failures. In 2012, a survivor contacted another survivor who was also a church officer seeking support and guidance. This contact triggered a chain of events that eventually led to disclosure to higher authorities. But the initial response was slow, failing to grasp the situation's severity. A journalist's inquiry amplified the issue, bringing it to a wider audience and forcing the church to acknowledge the allegations and begin an internal investigation. The Titus Trust, connected to Smyth's ministry, was also contacted. Their initial response: reluctance to fully engage and a prioritization of their reputation. In 2013, the Bishop of Ely, Stephen Conway, was informed of the abuse and contacted Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Welby, who had attended Ewarn camps with Smyth, knew of Smyth's background. Despite this, he referred the matter back to the Bishop of Ely, failing to take personal responsibility. Following Welby's direction, the Bishop of Ely contacted authorities in South Africa, where Smyth was living. But the response there lacked the urgency the situation demanded. Within the Church of England, a core group was established to investigate. However, this group's investigation lacked independence and expertise, focusing narrowly on whether Smyth's actions were criminal rather than addressing the broader institutional failures. In 2014, further concerns prompted renewed calls for action. A victim in Zimbabwe contacted the Bishop of Ely, concerned about potential abuse in South Africa. The bishop's safeguarding advisor informed the police, seeking further information from the victim. The Titus Trust, under mounting pressure, sought legal advice and began taking steps to manage the situation, but still prioritize their reputation. In 2015, the Scripture Union expressed caution about a joint independent case review, showing a continued reluctance to fully address the issue and cooperate with other organizations in holding Smyth accountable. So from 2012 to 2016, we see missed opportunities to hold Smyth accountable and address the institutional failures that allowed his abuse to continue. The Church's response, while showing some awareness of safeguarding needs, lacked urgency, transparency, and accountability. This inaction had devastating consequences for survivors. Now, the period between 2016 and 2019 was a time of reckoning. The full extent of Smyth's abuse finally came to light, forcing the Church of England to confront its decades-long failure to protect the vulnerable. In early 2016, concerns about Smyth's behavior in South Africa reached church leaders in Cape Town. These concerns prompted an internal investigation leading to Smyth's removal from ministry activities at Church on Main. In November 2016, the Oxford Diocese Safeguarding Children Advisor, alerted to the severity of the abuse, informed the police. This referral marked a critical turning point in the pursuit of justice, a shift within the Church towards prioritizing survivors. The police investigation, Operation Cubic, began gathering evidence from victims and witnesses in both the UK and South Africa. The investigation revealed a truly horrifying pattern of abuse spanning decades and continents. In February 2017, Channel 4 News aired a two-part exposé on Smyth's abuse, bringing the scandal to a much wider audience and sparking public outrage. The program featured interviews with survivors who bravely shared their stories. This exposé had a profound impact, forcing the Church of England to confront its failures. Archbishop Justin Welby issued a public apology and promised to meet with survivors. The National Safeguarding Team, NST, within the Church established a core group to coordinate its response. However, this group was criticized for its lack of independence and slow progress. In May 2017, Simon Doggart, associated with Smyth's abuse, was removed from his leadership position at Caldecott Preparatory School due to ill health. The NST, responding to public outcry, set up a survivor helpline and began offering counseling and support. However, these efforts were seen by some as too little too late. In October 2017, survivors protested outside Canterbury Cathedral, demanding accountability and greater transparency. This powerful protest underscored the need for the Church to prioritize the well-being of those harmed. Tragically, in August 2018, John Smyth died in South Africa before facing legal consequences in the UK. In October 2019, the Church of England announced the independent review led by Keith Macon to examine its handling of the allegations. The Macon Review, published in November 2024, exposed a deeply disturbing pattern of inaction, denial, and institutional failures. It provided a detailed and damning account of the Church's response, identifying numerous missed opportunities to prevent harm and hold Smyth accountable. The report's findings sparked further calls for reform and emphasized the Church's need to prioritize the safety and well-being of vulnerable individuals above all else. This period from 2016 to 2019 was a time of profound change and reckoning for the Church of England. The revelations of Smyth's abuse and the investigations exposed a disturbing pattern of institutional failures and a culture of secrecy. The Macon Review, a landmark report, provided a roadmap for reform and underscored the urgent need for the Church to prioritize safety and well-being, especially for the most vulnerable. The Macon Report provides a comprehensive account of John Smyth's abuse, the institutional failures that enabled it, and its long-lasting impact. The report analyzes Smyth's motivations, his methods, and the missed opportunities to intervene. It offers crucial insights into the dynamics of abuse within religious contexts. Smyth's abuse involved manipulating religious teachings, calculated grooming tactics, and physical and psychological violence to control his victims. He exploited his position of authority and trust within the Church to gain access to vulnerable young men, often at religious retreats and camps. The report highlights the institutional failures, the lack of adequate safeguarding policies, the culture of secrecy and denial, and the prioritization of institutional reputation over victims' well-being that allowed this abuse to continue for so long. It also examines the role of individual actors within the Church, identifying numerous instances where those aware of Smyth's abuse failed to act. These failures, both individual and institutional, had devastating consequences for Smyth's victims, prolonging their suffering and delaying healing and justice. The Macon Report's findings are a stark reminder of the importance of prioritizing safeguarding in any organization working with children and young people. It calls for transparency, accountability, and a commitment to placing victims' well-being above all else. It provides a roadmap for reform within the church and offers valuable lessons for other institutions seeking to prevent and address abuse. One of the report's most disturbing revelations is the extent to which individuals within the church knew about Smyth's abuse, but failed to act. This failure spanned decades and involved numerous people, including clergy, bishops, and other officials. Warnings about Smyth's behavior were repeatedly ignored or dismissed, often to protect the church's reputation. This had devastating consequences, allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. The report identifies key instances where intervention was possible. Smyth's 1981 application for ordination was rejected, but the reasons weren't widely shared. A detailed account of his abuse, the Rustin Report, was compiled in 1982 and shared with the select group, but no action was taken and the police weren't informed. Those who received the Rustin Report claimed they were protecting victims' reputations, but the victims themselves were never consulted. The Macon Report highlights the deeply concerning culture of secrecy and denial within the church, which allowed abusers like Smyth to operate with impunity for decades. This culture protected abusers and discouraged victims from coming forward, creating a devastating cycle of abuse. The report's recommendations emphasize the need for greater transparency, accountability, and a fundamental shift in the church's approach to safeguarding, putting the well-being of victims first. The Macon Report specifically addresses Justin Welby's connection to this scandal, examining his knowledge of Smyth's behavior and his actions. Welby's connection to Smyth came primarily from attending eye-warning camps, where Smyth was a leader. Welby acknowledged knowing Smyth but downplayed their relationship. The report reveals that Welby had received warnings about Smyth, including a direct caution from a friend to stay away from him. Welby claimed these warnings were vague and didn't explicitly mention abuse. In 2013, as Archbishop of Canterbury, Welby received a disclosure about Smyth's abuse. He referred it to the Bishop of Ely instead of personally ensuring a thorough investigation. The report concludes that while Welby may not have known the full extent of the abuse before 2013, his response to the disclosure was inadequate, falling short of what was expected of someone in his position. He didn't follow up on the referral, didn't contact the police, and didn't engage with the survivors. These omissions, the report argues, were missed opportunities to hold Smyth accountable. They represent a lack of the decisive leadership expected from the Archbishop. The report provides crucial insights into the devastating, long-lasting impact of Smyth's abuse on his victims. It details the physical and psychological trauma, highlighting the complex, often lifelong challenges faced by survivors. Beatings with canes and other implements resulted in injuries ranging from bruises and welts to broken skin and bleeding. The psychological impact was equally devastating: shame, guilt, worthlessness, betrayal, and PTSD, with its attendant flashbacks, nightmares, and anxiety. Smyth's manipulation of religious teachings compounded the trauma, leaving many survivors feeling spiritually betrayed. The report highlights the long-term consequences, noting that many survivors experience difficulties in personal relationships, careers, and overall well-being. It underscores the ongoing need for support and trauma-informed care. The survivor accounts in the report are a powerful testament to the devastating impact of abuse, highlighting the need for institutions like the Church of England to prioritize victims' well-being, implement robust safeguarding, and create a culture of transparency and accountability. The Macon Report doesn't just detail the abuse, it digs into the power dynamics and institutional culture that allowed it to flourish. Smyth, a prominent lawyer with charisma and influence within the church, created an environment where his behavior went unquestioned and victims were silenced. He used his authority to groom and manipulate, exploiting vulnerability and trust. He fostered a culture of fear and secrecy, ensuring victims were too afraid to speak out and that any concerns raised were dismissed. The Aroni camps, with their hierarchy and deference to authority, were a perfect breeding ground for this abuse. The culture there, prioritizing loyalty and obedience, discouraged dissent, and made it incredibly difficult for victims to come forward. The report also acknowledges the broader cultural context of the 70s and 80s. Societal attitudes towards abuse and safeguarding were different then. While this doesn't excuse the inaction, it provides context for understanding the challenges in addressing these historical allegations. The report emphasizes that the church's failure wasn't just about individual failings, it was systemic, rooted in the institution's culture and structures. It calls for a fundamental shift in the church's approach to safeguarding, putting victims' well-being first. This report is a stark reminder of how insidious abuse is and the devastating, long-lasting impact it has. It underscores the need for transparency and accountability, where victims feel safe to come forward and abusers are held responsible. One of the biggest challenges in this case is that so much happened decades ago. This makes gathering evidence and holding perpetrators accountable incredibly difficult. The Macon Report tackles this head-on, emphasizing the importance of listening to survivors, even without corroborating evidence. It acknowledges the complex legal and procedural issues in historical abuse cases, like statutes of limitations and the difficulty of obtaining witness testimony. But it stresses that these challenges shouldn't deter institutions from investigating thoroughly and seeking justice. The report stresses the importance of trauma-informed approaches, recognizing the impact of trauma on memory and behavior, providing support and avoiding re-traumatization. It calls for the Church to develop clear procedures for handling these cases, ensuring survivors are treated with respect and dignity, providing access to independent legal advice and counseling, and ensuring they have a voice. The Smyth case demonstrates the devastating, long-lasting impact of abuse even decades later. The report's focus on survivor testimonies and its call for trauma-informed approaches offer a way forward. The implications of the Macon Report extend far beyond the Church of England. Its emphasis on transparency, accountability, and survivor-centered approaches provides a model for other institutions facing similar issues. The call for an independent safeguarding body is particularly relevant for organizations that have historically handled abuse allegations internally, often prioritizing their own reputation. Mandatory reporting to statutory authorities is another crucial step towards ensuring all abuse is properly investigated and perpetrators held accountable. The report's recommendations for enhanced training on safeguarding best practices are also essential. By giving people the knowledge and skills to recognize and respond to abuse, institutions can create a culture of awareness and vigilance. The most challenging recommendation, but perhaps the most important, is the call for a culture change within institutions promoting transparency, accountability, and prioritizing the well-being of victims above all else. This requires a fundamental shift in values. The Smyth case offers invaluable lessons, highlighting the need for proactive safeguarding, transparency, accountability, and a survivor-centered approach. Justin Welby's resignation is a stark reminder of the importance of accountability, even at the highest levels of leadership. While the report acknowledges the complexities of Welby's involvement, it also underscores the need for leaders to take responsibility for their actions and omissions in responding to abuse allegations. The report raises questions about the responsibility of leaders in creating cultures of safety and accountability. Leaders need to be proactive in preventing abuse, respond decisively to allegations, and prioritize the well-being of victims above all else. Welby's resignation also highlights the specific challenges of addressing historical abuse, especially when those involved hold positions of power. Independent investigations and mandatory reporting become even more critical in ensuring thorough investigation and accountability, regardless of status. Welby's resignation is a significant step, but only one step in a long process. The Church of England must continue grappling with its past, implement the report's recommendations, and create a culture where abuse is never tolerated and victims are always supported. Thank you for joining me on Church History Stories for this deep dive into the Justin Welby resignation and the Macon Report. Please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into church history. The question I leave you with is this: how can we as individuals and as a society ensure better protection for the vulnerable, particularly within religious contexts?